The nameplate was still on the table when I got there. Cream cardstock, gold script, my name spelled correctly for once, reserved for Mr. Calloway. It was sitting 6 inches from an empty wine glass, at the head of a table for 14, in a private room at Aurelia that my wife's law firm had rented for the night. The only problem was, the chair behind that nameplate wasn't empty. There was a man sitting in it, one hand resting on the back of my wife's chair, like he'd done it 100 times before, laughing at something she'd just said, wearing a jacket that fit him the way mine used to fit me before I started paying for the tailor on Newbury Street to take mine in twice a year. I stood in the doorway of that private room for 4 full seconds before anyone noticed me. I know it was 4 seconds because I counted them. The way you count things when your brain needs somewhere safe to put itself while the rest of you catches up to what your eyes are telling you. 4 seconds. Long enough to see the way his thumb moved against the fabric of her chair. Long enough to see her laugh at whatever he'd said. The real laugh. Not the polite one she used at these dinners, the one I used to think only I could get out of her. Long enough to see 12 of her colleagues at that table, every single one of them aware enough to glance at the door when I walked in, and not one of them surprised to see me confused. They were surprised to see me at all. My name is Derek Calloway. I'm 43 years old. I run a wealth management firm out of a glass office on Federal Street in Boston, 3 floors up from where I started it 11 years ago with 4 clients, and a business loan I'd co-signed with my father's house as collateral. I have built a career on reading rooms before the room knows what it's telling me. I read that room in 4 seconds, and what it told me took 11 years of instinct and about 4 seconds of math to translate into English. I had not been dropped from a guest list by accident. I had been erased from one on purpose. Nadia saw me first. My wife, 38 years old, 5 months into partner track at Whitfield and Cross, the corporate litigation firm on State Street, where she had spent the last 6 years of her life becoming exactly the kind of lawyer she used to say she wanted to be back when she was still in night classes, and I was still paying her tuition out of a business account that hadn't broken even yet. She saw me, and her face did something I will spend the rest of my life trying to describe accurately, because surprise isn't right, and guilt isn't quite right either. It was closer to the look a person gets when a door they were sure they'd locked turns out to still be open. Not shock that I existed, shock that I'd shown up. Derek. She said my name like a correction, like I'd walked into the wrong meeting. I got the calendar invite, I said. 7:30, private room, Aurelia. I told you I'd be here. The plans changed, she said. I texted you. She had not texted me. I checked my phone in that doorway, in front of 13 strangers and one man with his hand on the back of my wife's chair, and there was nothing. No text. No missed call, just a calendar reminder I'd set myself 2 weeks earlier, the day she made partner, and asked me, almost as an afterthought, if I wanted to come to the dinner the firm was throwing for her. I remember, standing there, noticing the small details of the room, the way you notice details in a photograph you already know is going to matter later. The candles burned down about an inch, which meant the dinner had been running for a while before I arrived, not just starting. The bottles of wine on the table, 2 of them empty. The kind of empty that happens over the course of a real evening, not 15 minutes. A cake box, flattened now, pushed to the side of the sideboard. The way boxes look after whatever was inside them has already been cut and served and eaten. This wasn't a dinner I was fashionably late to. This was a dinner that had been fully underway for a significant stretch of time, one I had simply not been told the real start of. The man in my chair stood up then, mid-30s, good suit. The kind of easy confidence that comes from never having had to build anything from nothing. He extended his hand like we were meeting at a conference. Preston Vale, he said. I don't think we've officially met. I'm on the partnership committee. I looked at his hand. I looked at the nameplate with my name on it, sitting 8 inches from where he'd been sitting all night, with his arm around the back of my wife's chair, like it was furniture he already owned. And then I looked at Nadia, because I wanted to see her face when I said the only thing I had the composure to say in that room. You're in my seat, I said. Preston Vale laughed, an easy, confused laugh, the laugh of a man who genuinely thought this was a misunderstanding about table assignments. I think there's been some mix-up with the seating chart, he said. There hasn't, I said, and I turned around and I walked out of that private room, past the maitre d' who'd let me in without checking a list because my name was on a nameplate somewhere in that building, out through the restaurant, past 40 strangers eating dinner who had no idea that the quietest, most controlled thing they'd ever witness was happening 6 feet from their table, and out onto Boylston Street into a September night that had gone cold early. I did not call Nadia back when she called 4 minutes later. I did not answer the second call, or the third. I stood on the sidewalk outside Aurelia with my phone buzzing in my hand, and I did the thing I have done my entire career when a deal starts to smell wrong, and everyone around me wants me to react immediately. I did nothing. I put the phone in my pocket, and I started walking. And somewhere around the corner of Berkeley Street, I started making a very different kind of call. Before I tell you what I did next, you should understand how we got here. Because the story of Derek and Nadia Calloway is the kind of story that, in hindsight, was writing its own ending long before I was smart enough to read it. I met Nadia 9 years ago at a fundraiser for a legal aid nonprofit my firm sponsored. She was 29, working as a paralegal at a mid-sized firm in the financial district, taking night classes at Suffolk with the specific, focused hunger of someone who has decided exactly what they want and has simply not gotten there yet. I recognized that hunger because I'd built my entire career out of the same material. I was 34. I had 4 clients and a lease I couldn't really afford, and a conviction that I was right about something the rest of the industry hadn't figured out yet. We talked for 2 hours at that fundraiser about nothing important and everything important. She told me she wanted to litigate, not just practice law, actually stand in a courtroom and win things. I told her about my first year running the firm, sleeping 4 hours a night, closing my first real account with a client who almost walked twice before he signed. She listened the way very few people listen, like she was studying the architecture of what I was saying instead of just waiting for her turn to talk. We started seeing each other 2 weeks later, quietly at first, dinners after her night classes let out, long walks along the Charles, because neither of us wanted the evening to end, and neither of us was ready to say that out loud yet. I remember the exact moment I knew I wasn't going to let her go. She was explaining, over cheap Thai food at a table for 2, the difference between a motion to dismiss and a motion for summary judgment with the kind of intensity most people reserve for describing something that happened to them personally. And I realized I had stopped listening to the content of what she was saying and started listening to the fact of who she was becoming while she said it. I fell for her within a month. Within a year we were married. City Hall wedding, 40 guests, a dinner afterward at a restaurant that no longer exists on Charles Street. My father gave a toast that made half the room cry. Something about watching a man who'd spent his 20s building a business finally build a life to put it inside of. I believed every word of that toast for 9 years. She got into law school 2 years after we married. Boston College, night program at first. Then full-time, once my business had grown enough that we could afford for her to stop working entirely and focus. I told her exactly what you'd expect me to tell her, because it was true and I meant every word of it. Don't worry about the money, I've got it. Focus on the work. First year tuition, $61,000. Second year, $64,000. Third year, $66,000, plus bar prep courses, plus a laptop when hers died during finals, plus the 2-bedroom upgrade on Beacon Street so she'd have a proper office to study in instead of working off the kitchen table. I remember the exact conversation where I told her not to worry about any of it. We were sitting on the floor of our old apartment on Beacon Street, acceptance letter still in her hands, and she was already doing the math out loud, already talking about part-time paralegal work she could pick up around her class schedule, already building a version of the next 3 years that involved her being exhausted the entire time. I took the letter out of her hands and told her to stop. You're not working a second job through law school, I said. You focus on the work. I'll handle tuition, I'll handle the apartment, I'll handle all of it. That's what this is for. I gestured, vaguely, at the life we'd built, the business that had finally started generating real margin the year before. Derek, that's $200,000 over 3 years, she said. That's not a small thing to just hand someone. I'm not handing it to someone, I told her. I'm handing it to my wife, who is going to be one of the best litigators in this city. I'd rather spend the money believing in that than spend it on almost anything else I can think of. She cried a little that night, the good kind of crying, and told me she'd never forget it. I believed her completely. I still believe she meant it in that moment. I just don't think either of us understood yet that a debt like that, even one given freely, without conditions, without a single string attached to it, can still quietly become something a person resents the longer they carry the shape of having needed it. I didn't think of it as an investment. I thought of it as a marriage. I built my business on believing in undervalued things before the market caught up to their worth. And somewhere in the last 9 years, I had apparently started applying that same instinct to my wife, without ever once stopping to ask whether she wanted to be believed in that particular way, or whether she'd started, somewhere in year 2 of law school, believing in something else entirely. I introduced Nadia to Preston Vale myself. 18 months ago, at a firm mixer I only attended because Nadia asked me to come. Preston was newly on the partnership track at Whitfield & Cross, a litigator with a good record and better connections, the kind of young associate senior partners like to be seen mentoring. He was charming in the specific way that people who have never lost anything important are charming. Confident without being tested. I remember shaking his hand that night and thinking, not unkindly, that he reminded me of myself before the business loan, before the 4 a.m. mornings, before I understood what it actually costs to build something instead of simply being handed the appearance of it. I started noticing things about 5 months ago. Small things, the kind of things that don't mean anything on their own and only start meaning something once you've collected enough of them to see the pattern they were quietly assembling behind your back. Nadia started taking calls in the hallway. Not always, but consistently enough that I began to notice the rhythm of it. Her phone would light up on the counter, and she'd glance at it, and something in her shoulders would change before she'd even picked it up, like she already knew who it was, and had already decided the conversation wasn't for me to hear. She started staying late at the office, more than the partnership track actually required. I know this because I run a business too, and I know what billable hours actually look like on a calendar, and the calendar she was living on had gaps in it that didn't correspond to anything her firm was tracking. She stopped asking about my work. For 8 years, Nadia had been the person I talked through every deal with, every client problem, every hard call. She had opinions. She pushed back on my reasoning when she thought I was wrong, which happened more than I like to admit, and which was one of the reasons I trusted her judgment more than almost anyone's. And then, somewhere around the 6-month mark, she just stopped asking. Not abruptly. Gradually, the way a room gets quieter when someone starts spending their attention somewhere else, so slowly you don't notice the silence until it's the only thing left. There were other things too, things I only assembled into a full picture after the fact. The way you can only see the outline of a building once construction is finished, and the scaffolding comes down. She started declining wine at dinners we hosted together, then drinking more than usual on nights I wasn't invited anywhere. She rearranged her closet twice in 4 months. Small things shifted to the back, new things appearing that I didn't recognize and didn't ask about, because asking felt, at the time, like an accusation I wasn't ready to make. She started running later on weeknights, depositions, she'd say, or prep for a filing. And I believed her the way you believe someone you've built 9 years of trust with, because the alternative required admitting that trust might not be a permanent structure, after all, that it needs maintenance the same way anything else does. And neither of us had been doing that maintenance in a long time. If you've ever had that feeling, the slow build of noticing something is wrong before you have any proof of it, let me know in the comments how long it took you to trust your own instincts. And if you want more stories like this one when they come out, go ahead and subscribe now, because it's about to get a lot more interesting. I noticed her phone lock screen changed. Small thing. She'd had the same photo on it for 3 years, the two of us at the Cape, the summer before she started law school. One evening in July, it was just a photo of the harbor, no people in it at all. And when I asked her about it, she said she wanted something calmer to look at during exam season. I didn't push. I filed it away, the way I file away every anomaly in a due diligence report that doesn't immediately explain itself, trusting that if it mattered, the pattern would eventually show its shape. The last thing I noticed, the thing that finally made me start paying real attention, was the way she'd started looking at me during conversations. Not through me exactly, more like I was a fixture in a house she'd already mentally moved out of. You know that look when you see it, you just don't want to. I didn't confront her. Not because I was afraid of what she'd say. Because I have spent 11 years learning that confrontation without information is just noise. And noise doesn't win anything. It just tells the other side you're rattled before you've even understood what you're rattled about. So I watched. I paid attention to her calendar, to the names that came up more than they should have, to a firm partnership dinner that had somehow grown a guest list I wasn't consulted on until 2 weeks before it happened. And even then, only in passing, almost as an afterthought. There's a dinner for the partnership announcement. You should come if you want. If you want. 9 years of tuition and bar prep and career building, and the invitation to celebrate the finish line sounded like an afterthought extended to a distant cousin. 3 days before that dinner, my assistant, a sharp, unflappable woman named Priya, who has worked with me for 6 years and has never once brought me a piece of gossip that didn't turn out to matter, stopped by my office at the end of the day and closed the door, which she almost never does. "This isn't really my business," she said, "but my sister works events for Aurelia, and she mentioned they had to redo a seating chart twice this week for a partnership dinner, Whitfield and Cross. She said the client, a Miss Calloway, asked for a name to be moved off the head table and reseated near the kitchen entrance, and then asked for the placeholder card removed from that seat entirely the second time." I sat with that for a long moment before I answered her. "Did she say whose name?" "She didn't know it meant anything to you," Priya said carefully. "I only put it together because of the last name. I wasn't sure if I should say anything." "You should always say something," I told her, and I meant it, though I also understood in that moment that I had just been handed a piece of information I wasn't ready to use yet. I didn't call Nadia that night to ask her about it. I didn't mention it at all. I told myself I wanted to see it with my own eyes before I decided what it meant, which was true, but it was also the kind of decision a person makes when part of them is still hoping there's an explanation generous enough to make the information stop mattering. There wasn't. I know that now. I think some part of me already knew it then too. The night of the dinner, I left the office early, which I almost never do, and stopped by the apartment to change into the suit I'd had pressed specifically for the occasion. Nadia had already left by the time I got home. The firm wanted her there early for photos, she'd said, over a rushed conversation 2 mornings earlier that I now understand was the last real conversation we had before everything changed. I remember standing in front of the mirror in the bedroom, straightening my tie, running through what I planned to say if anyone asked me to toast her. I'd been rehearsing it in my head for a week. Something about watching her turn a night class ambition into an actual courtroom career. Something about how proud I was. Something true and unguarded that I don't think I'd have had the composure to say out loud 12 hours later. I called her from the car on the way over, just to confirm the room number, and she didn't pick up. I told myself she was busy with photos. I told myself a lot of things in that car that turned out not to be true. And I think, looking back, that the version of me sitting in that back seat, still hopeful, still checking his tie in the rearview mirror, was the last version of that particular marriage that got to exist in a state of not knowing. By the time I walked through the doors of Aurelia 11 minutes later, that version of me was already gone, even though I didn't understand it yet. I want to pause here and tell you something about myself, because I think it matters for what comes next. I have sat across boardroom tables from men who would eat you alive for a rounding error on a term sheet, and I have never once let them see my handshake. That's not bravado. That's just what the job does to you over 11 years. You learn that the most expensive thing you can do in a negotiation is let the other side see exactly how much something costs you. I have used that instinct my entire career to protect my clients' money. Standing on Boylston Street with my phone buzzing in my pocket and my wife's third missed call lighting up the screen, I used it, for the first time, to protect myself. The first call I made was to Anita Reyes. Anita has been my attorney for 9 years, since before the firm had a name people recognized, and she is the kind of lawyer who has never once asked me, "Are you sure?" when I've told her what I wanted done. She asked what I needed, and how fast. She picked up on the second ring, which for 9:40 on a weeknight told me she already had some sense that this call was coming, or maybe she just always answers like that. "Derek, what happened?" I told her, not with adjectives, just the facts, laid out the way I'd lay out a due diligence summary. The dinner, the nameplate, the empty chair that wasn't empty. Preston Vale's hand on the back of Nadia's seat, like it had been there all season. She was quiet for a second. Then, "How fast do you want to move?" "Tonight," I said. "I want the separation paperwork drafted before she gets home." "Done." "Anything else?" There was something else. And this is the part of the story where I have to tell you about a company called Lucent Filings. 2 years ago, Preston Vale came to me, not directly, but through a mutual contact in the legal tech space, with a pitch for a document automation platform he'd built with a former classmate, something designed to streamline discovery filings for litigation firms. The product was genuinely good. The execution needed capital and credibility it didn't have. I looked at the numbers, I looked at the team, and I did what I do. I took a 68% stake in Lucent Filings for $2.2 million when the company was valued at just over $3 million. I became Preston's majority partner. I opened doors for him, introduced him to 2 of my largest institutional clients, brought in my own compliance counsel to clean up his contracts, put my firm's name behind his company in rooms he couldn't have gotten into on his own 18 months earlier. I did this, by the way, at a dinner Nadia and I hosted at our apartment, because that is how I have always done business. Close, personal, invested in people before I invest in their companies. I introduced Preston Vale to my wife myself at my own dining table while I was leaning back over dessert talking about growth projections and market positioning. Preston had grown up outside Philadelphia, private school, a law degree from a school whose name opens doors before a resume ever gets read, and a self-assurance I initially mistook for competence, because in this industry the two get confused constantly, and it took me longer than it should have to tell them apart. In his case, he was smart. I want to be fair about that. But there is a specific kind of smart that comes from never once having to build something from a position of actual risk, and Preston had that kind. Everything he'd ever built, he'd built with somebody else's safety net underneath him, and I think, looking back, he recognized in Nadia the same hunger I'd recognized 9 years earlier. Except where I responded to that hunger by funding it, he responded to it by flattering it, which costs considerably less, and, in the short term, apparently pays considerably better. He came to our apartment for dinner 4 times over the following year. I remember specific things about those evenings now that I didn't think mattered at the time, the way he always sat across from Nadia instead of beside her, angling every question in her direction even when the conversation was ostensibly about his own company's cap table. I remember thinking, generously, that he simply respected her legal mind. And at some point during one of those dinners, while I was busy believing I was building a mentee, Preston Vale was busy building something else entirely with the woman sitting to my left. Lucent Filings, the first told Anita, "I want to sell the stake, all of it. Tonight, or as close to tonight as the paperwork allows." There was a pause on the line, longer than the first one. "Derek, that stake is worth north of $40 million at the last valuation round. You sure you want to move that fast?" "I'm sure," I said. "That's exactly why I want to move fast." What I didn't destroy, because I'm not in the business of burning things down out of spite, was the underlying company. Lucent Filings had a real product and a real market. What I was removing was the foundation Preston Vale had been quietly building his entire professional identity on top of, while using my money, my network, and apparently my wife, to construct a version of himself he hadn't actually earned yet. "Find a buyer," I told Anita. "Someone who wants the product, not the personnel. I don't care about premium. I care about speed. I want this closed before the market opens Monday. You understand this is going to look aggressive to anyone watching from the outside," Anita said. "A stake this size, moved this fast, right after a personal falling out with the minority holder. A good lawyer on his side could try to make noise about timing." "Let them," I said. "I have every right to sell an asset I fully control, for legitimate business reasons, on whatever timeline I choose. There's no fiduciary relationship between me and Preston Vale that requires me to give him advance notice or a chance to counter. The paperwork will hold up because it's clean. It's clean because I'm not doing anything except exactly what I'm entitled to do." "I know it'll hold up," she said. "I just want you making this decision with your eyes open, not your adrenaline." "My eyes are open, Anita. They've been open for about 6 months. I was just slow to admit what I was looking at." She was quiet for a beat. "Okay," she said. "I'll have a term sheet template ready within the hour and start reaching out to the 2 buyers I think move fastest. Cascade first. They've been sniffing around Lucent's compliance stack for 2 quarters already, so they won't need much convincing." She said she'd start making calls immediately. The second call I made that night was to the bank, to begin the process of separating our joint accounts. Not draining anything, not doing anything vindictive, just cleanly, immediately, drawing a line where a line needed to exist. The third call, the one that surprised even me, was to my father. Walter Calloway is 73 years old. He spent 31 years as a union electrician before he retired, and he still lives in the same 3-bedroom house in Dorchester where I grew up, the one he finished paying off in 2011, and refuses to leave even though I've offered a dozen times to buy him something newer, something easier. He taught me how to play chess when I was 7, at the kitchen table in that house, using a set with 2 pawns missing that he'd replaced with mismatched buttons from my mother's sewing box. I remember losing to him for almost 2 years straight before I won a single game, and I remember the exact lesson that finally turned things around. Not a better opening, not a clever trap, but the discipline of not reacting the moment he took something of mine off the board. I used to sweep my pieces back defensively the second I lost a pawn, panicking, trying to protect everything at once. He'd just sit there and let me flail until I ran myself into a worse position than the one pawn had ever cost me. "The board doesn't care that you're upset," he told me once, not unkindly. "It only cares what you do next." I was 9 years old. I didn't understand it then the way I understood it standing in that doorway at Aurelia 34 years later, but the lesson never left me. He taught me something I've carried into every boardroom I've ever sat in since. The move that matters isn't the one you make when you're winning. It's the one you make after you've already lost a piece, because that's the move that tells you whether you're actually going to lose the game. I told him what happened. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "Did she know what she was doing when she did it?" "Yes," I said. "Then she made her choice already. You're just the one who has to make his now." A pause. "What do you want your move to look like?" "Quiet," I said. "Clean. Final. That's the right answer," he said. "Don't make noise, Derek. Don't give anyone a story where you look like you lost your composure. Just close the door and let the silence finish the sentence for you." I hung up. I stood on the sidewalk on Berkeley Street for another minute, watching the traffic on Boylston. And then I did the thing that 13 strangers in that private dining room had not gotten to see. I let myself feel it. Not for long, not in a way anyone driving past would have noticed. But standing there in the cold, I felt every single piece of what had just happened land at once. 9 years. A law degree I'd funded out of belief rather than obligation. A man I'd made rich sitting in a chair with my name on it. And it was, for about 90 seconds, the most complete loss I have ever experienced. Then I put my coat collar up, and I called a car, and I went home to start moving my things into the guest suite of a building I already partially owned, because I had learned a long time ago that the smartest move in a losing position is the one that gets made before your opponent realizes you already know you've lost the piece. I got home before Nadia did. I moved my father's watch and my grandfather's tools and the signed first edition of a book that had been on our shelf since before we were married into a bag, and I packed a suitcase with the efficiency of a man who has done hard things under time pressure for a living. Then I sat in the dark of the study and I waited. The way you wait for a market to open when you already know which direction the number is going to move. She got home at 11:52. I heard her key in the door, heard the particular hesitation in her footsteps once she saw the light on in the study, heard her stop in the doorway. "You're up," she said. "I am." She was still in the dress she'd worn to the dinner, a deep green thing I remembered her buying for the occasion, and there was a looseness to the way she was standing that told me she'd had 2 or 3 glasses of wine to get through the rest of that evening without me in it. "We should talk," she said. "We should," I agreed. She came in and sat down across from me, in the same chair where, over the years, she had walked me through moot court arguments, and I had walked her through deal structures, where we had built, I thought, the kind of partnership that survives things. That version of the room felt very far away. "You saw," she said. It wasn't a question. "I saw. Preston and I," she started, then stopped, then started again. "It's been going on about 8 months. I didn't plan it. I know everyone says that, but it's true. I didn't say anything. I let the silence do what my father had told me it would do. I should have told you," she continued, and her voice had that rehearsed quality people get when they've run a conversation in their head so many times the real version comes out sounding like a script. "But I didn't know how. And then I just kept not telling you, and by the time I knew what I actually wanted, it felt too late to do it any other way. What do you want? I asked. She looked at me directly for the first time since she'd walked in. I want a divorce, Derek. I think I've been unhappy longer than I've let myself admit, and I know this isn't the way anyone should find out. I know that. But I also know that if I'd told you 6 months ago, you would have tried to fix it, and I don't think it's fixable anymore. I looked at my wife. 38 years old, partner track litigator. A law degree I had personally funded to the tune of nearly $200,000 across 3 years, plus prep courses, plus a laptop, plus an apartment upgrade so she'd have somewhere quiet to study. You didn't invite me to the partnership dinner, I said. Not really. You told me about it 2 weeks late, like an afterthought, and then you gave my seat to another man. Something shifted across her face. I know, she said. I should have handled that differently. What exactly did Preston Vale sponsor? I asked, keeping my voice level. In your career. What did he actually contribute that I didn't already pay for? She was quiet for a moment. That's not fair. I paid for 3 years of tuition, Nadia. I paid for bar prep, for the apartment, for the laptop when yours died during finals. I introduced Preston Vale to my own network. I gave him a stake in his own company's success he wouldn't have had without me. And tonight, he sat in a chair with my name on it and put his hand on the back of your seat while I stood in a doorway. She didn't argue with any of it. That told me more than an argument would have. Was it always him? I asked. Or was there someone before him too, and I just never noticed? No, she said quickly, and something about the speed of that answer made me believe it. It was only him. Derek, I need you to know that. I don't actually need to know that, I said, and I meant it more calmly than it probably sounded. It doesn't change what happens next either way. Doesn't it matter to you at all? She asked. It matters, I said. It just doesn't change the decision. You can betray someone once, or you can betray them for 8 months with a rotating cast of people, and the answer at the end of either version is the same. You start over. She wrapped her arms around herself, and for a second, I saw something in her face that looked almost like the version of her I'd fallen for at that fundraiser 9 years earlier, before any of this, before either of us had learned what the other one was capable of. It didn't change anything. I want to be honest about that. I noticed it, and then I let it pass. The way you let a familiar song play out on the radio, even though you already know exactly how it ends. You seem very calm, she finally said. I am calm. You found out tonight. Shouldn't you be... She searched for the word. Devastated. The first stood up and straightened my jacket. I've spent 11 years learning to make decisions in difficult moments without letting emotion make them for me. You, of all people, know that about me. That's it? She said, something close to panic finally showing through the composure she'd walked in with. 9 years, Derek. You're not even going to... What would you like me to do, Nadia? I asked. Fight for a marriage you already decided was over 8 months ago? Make a scene. That's not who I am, and you've known that since the night we met. I walked to the door of the study. I've already called Anita. You'll hear from her office in the morning. I'll be staying elsewhere tonight. You're really doing this, she said quietly, like she needed to hear herself say it to believe it. You already did this, I said. I'm just the one closing the door. I stayed at a hotel on the waterfront that night, in a suite I'd booked from the back of the car on the way over. I was still awake when Anita called at 6:20 the next morning. We have a buyer, she said. Cascade Legal Technologies. They've been circling Lucent's Discovery Automation stack for 2 quarters. They'll take the full stake at current valuation. No haggling. They want it closed before their board meeting Wednesday. How much? $41.3 million. Send it, I said. You're certain? I'm certain that the moment this closes, Preston Vale loses his majority backer, his institutional credibility, and any leverage he has left on that board. Cascade will want their own leadership in place within 90 days. He'll be a minority stakeholder in a company he no longer controls. He built the product, Derek. He had a good idea, I said. The infrastructure that turned a good idea into a $41 million exit. That was mine. I am entitled to sell what's mine to whoever I choose, whenever I choose to sell it. That's not revenge. That's business. The term sheet was signed by 9 that morning. By 9:40, my phone had started ringing. Nadia first, then a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be Preston Vale. Calling from a blocked line like that would somehow make me more likely to answer. I let all of it go to voicemail. I ordered coffee from room service and read the paper and let Anita handle the calls that mattered, which, at that point, none of the ones coming into my personal cell actually were. By 11, the texts had started arriving in earnest. Short ones first, the kind people send when they're still hoping brevity will make you respond faster. Call me. This is insane. You're going to regret this. Then longer ones from Nadia, paragraphs that started out accusatory and ended somewhere closer to pleading, the tone shifting the way it does when someone realizes anger isn't producing the reaction they need it to produce. By early afternoon, her texts had shifted again into something closer to bargaining. Reminders of specific good years, a photo she sent of the two of us at a friend's wedding 4 years earlier, a message that just said, "Do you really want to throw away everything we built over this?" I noticed, reading that particular message twice, that she still hadn't used the word sorry in any of them yet. That detail told me something I didn't fully understand until much later, which is that she was still, even then, negotiating from a position of believing she hadn't done anything that actually required an apology, only something that required damage control. Then, at 11:20, Preston Vale texted me directly for the first time from a number I hadn't given him and hadn't expected him to have. "We need to talk. This affects a lot of people who had nothing to do with your marriage." I let that one sit for 6 hours. Then I called him back, because I decided I would rather control the terms of that conversation than let him control the terms of the next 12. He picked up on the first ring. "Derek, thank you for calling. You have 5 minutes," I said. "The Cascade deal," he said, and I could hear him trying to keep his voice level, and mostly failing. "You know what this does to my position. I've got engineers who've been with me since the seed round, people who trusted the company because your name was on it. This isn't just about you and me." "You're right," I said. "It isn't. It's about a due diligence process I would have done for any portfolio company where the personal relationship underpinning the investment stopped existing. That's what happened here. The relationship stopped existing the night I found you sitting in a chair with my name on it." There was a pause, long enough that I could hear a door close on his end, like he'd stepped somewhere more private to say what came next. "I never meant for you to find out like that." "That's the part I keep coming back to," I said. "Not that it happened. People's marriages fall apart, Preston. That's not a crime, and honestly, it's not really my business to punish you for wanting my wife. My business is deciding what I'm willing to keep funding, and I am not willing to keep funding a man who sat at my dinner table for a year while doing exactly what you were doing. So this is punishment. It's a rational reallocation of capital," I said. "You'll have Cascade's terms in your inbox by Wednesday. My advice, and I'll only give you this once, take the deal, keep the 10 or 11% you'll have left, and go build something you don't need somebody else's marriage to fund next time." I hung up before he could answer. It was, I'll admit, the closest I came in that entire week to raising my voice. And even then, I don't think I did. I went into the office the following Monday like nothing had happened, because in every way that actually mattered to my business, nothing had. A stake had been sold at a fair valuation to a buyer who wanted it, and that transaction would look, on paper, exactly as clean as every other deal I'd ever closed. My team didn't know the personal details yet, though I assumed most of them would within a week. The way these things travel through an industry small enough that everyone eventually knows everyone else's business. Priya had coffee waiting on my desk when I walked in, and she didn't ask a single question, which told me she already understood more than she was letting on. Around 10, one of my senior associates, a sharp young analyst named Owen, who'd been with the firm 3 years, knocked on my door, holding a printout of the Cascade term sheet. "This closed fast," he said carefully. "The way you say something when you're fishing for context you don't feel entitled to ask for directly." "It needed to," I said. "Understood," he said, and left it there, which is exactly why I'd hired him in the first place. There's a particular kind of professionalism that knows when curiosity isn't actually its job, and Owen has always had it. I made a mental note that morning to give him more responsibility on the next deal, partly because he'd earned it, and partly, I'll admit, because a man who doesn't ask questions he isn't owed the answers to is a rarer asset in this business than people realize. I spent that Monday doing what I always do on Mondays, reviewing portfolio performance, taking calls with 2 of our institutional partners, sitting through a pipeline meeting where nobody in the room had any idea that the man running it had slept 4 hours in a hotel bed the night before, after finding out his marriage was over in a private dining room at Aurelia. There is something almost therapeutic about a full calendar in a moment like that. Work doesn't ask you how you're feeling. It just asks whether the numbers are right. And for one Monday, I was deeply grateful that they were. By 11, there was a knock at my door. My brother, Sean, was standing in the hallway with 2 coffees, and the particular look he gets when he already knows exactly what happened and has decided to show up anyway, instead of asking about it over the phone. "Dad called me," he said, walking in without waiting to be invited, because that is exactly what Sean does. "Said you needed company, not advice. I appreciate that, good, because I'm fresh out of advice anyway." He put a coffee down in front of me. We sat for a while, the way brothers can sit, without needing to fill every silence with words. The harbor was gray outside the window, a container ship moving slow and enormous somewhere out past the islands. "You sold the stake," he said eventually. "Not a question. This morning. How much?" 41.3. He let out a low whistle. "And the divorce? Filed by end of week. Massachusetts doesn't require fault. It'll be clean." Sean turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "Do you think she loved you?" The question landed differently than I expected it to. I sat with it for a second. "I think she did," I said finally. "For a while. I think she got into that world. All those partners and associates who'd never had to build anything from scratch, and she started wanting to be one of them, instead of the person married to someone who built his firm out of a 2-bedroom apartment. I think Preston Vale was just there at the moment she started wanting that." "And the chair," Sean said. "The nameplate. That wasn't an accident." "No," I agreed. "It wasn't. People do things like that when they've already made up their mind, but they want the other person to be the one who pulls the trigger. It's easier to be left than to leave." Sean was quiet for a while after that, looking out at the harbor. "You know what gets me," he finally said, "is the money. Not the 41 million. You'll make that back. You always do. I mean, the tuition, the bar prep, all of it. You spent years of your life funding somebody's entire career because you loved her, and she spent the last chunk of it letting another guy take the credit for it in front of a room full of her coworkers." "I've thought about that part more than the rest of it, honestly," I said. "The affair, I understand. People fall out of love. They get tempted. It happens more than any of us like to admit. What I can't get past is that she let him stand there and be thanked for something I built. That's not an affair anymore. That's theft. Just dressed up politely enough that nobody at the table was going to call it that out loud." "You going to be okay?" Sean asked, in the tone he only ever uses when he genuinely wants the honest answer instead of the easy one. "Eventually," I said. "Not today, but eventually." "Good," he said, "because Mom's going to call you in about an hour, and she is not going to accept eventually as an answer, so you might want to get better at saying it convincingly before then." I thought about that for a long time after Sean left. Whether any of it mattered. The money, the math, the specific cruelty of a nameplate nobody bothered to remove. I decided, eventually, that only one part of it actually did. Not anymore. My mother called around noon. Sean had told her, which I'd expected, because my family has never been especially good at keeping things from each other for longer than a few hours. She didn't ask me if I was okay, which I appreciated more than I could have explained to her in the moment. "You did the right thing, selling that stake fast," she said, which surprised me, because my mother has spent 30 years telling me to slow down, to think things through, to not let the business version of myself make decisions the rest of my life has to live with. "You don't think it was too much?" I asked. "I think," she said, "that you spent 9 years being generous with a woman who apparently decided generosity was owed to her instead of given to her. There's a difference, Derek, and I don't think you're wrong for finally noticing it." She paused. "Your father says you're being quiet about it. Don't be too quiet. Quiet and numb aren't the same thing, and I want you to make sure you know which one you're doing." I told her I did. I'm not sure, even now, that I was being entirely honest with her when I said it. There's a version of composure that's actually strength, and there's a version that's just delay. And in the days right after that dinner, I don't think I always knew which version I was standing in. Nadia showed up at the hotel that afternoon. The front desk called up to ask if I was expecting a Miss Calloway, and I told them to send her up, because whatever else was true, I wasn't going to hide from a conversation I'd already survived once the night before. She looked nothing like the composed woman who'd stood in the doorway of my study 12 hours earlier. She'd changed out of the green dress into jeans, and there was something unguarded in her face that felt, for the first time in months, genuinely real. Preston called me this morning, she said, sitting down across from me. He's furious. He said Cascade is taking over the company, that you sold overnight without any warning. I did. He's going to lose control of everything he built. He still holds a minority stake, I said. He's not destitute. He'll figure out how to build the next thing, the way everyone does when the floor changes underneath them. You could have talked to him first, given him time to find another investor, restructure the board, something. I could have, I agreed. I didn't want to. I spent 18 months treating Preston Vale like family, Nadia. He sat at our table. I don't owe him a courtesy call before I decide who I'm in business with. Is this punishment? She asked, looking at me directly. It's business, Nadia. I'm unwinding an investment because the personal relationship that made that investment comfortable no longer exists. That's a completely legitimate reason to sell. Anita would tell you the same thing. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. I didn't mean for it to happen the way it did. The dinner, the seating. I told the coordinator to move you down the table because I didn't want it to feel awkward with Preston there, and then it just got out of hand. I should have told her to seat you at all. I should have told you the truth months ago instead of letting you find out like that. I know, I said, and I meant it. You were celebrating something real. You earned that partnership. Nothing about what happened between us takes that away from you. Then why does it feel like you're trying to take everything else? Because you erased me, I said. Not by accident. You buried the invitation, you gave my seat away, and then you let a room full of people you work with watch me find out in real time. That's not a mistake, Nadia. That's a statement, whether you meant it as one or not. She didn't argue with that either. The divorce will be straightforward, I told her. I'm not looking to make this ugly. You'll be treated fairly, but I need you to understand something. I leaned forward. I spent 9 years building a foundation under you because I believed in what you could become. Not because I needed credit, not because I needed a seat at a dinner, because that's what you do when you actually believe in someone. I paused. I hope the partnership is everything you wanted it to be. I genuinely do, but I'm done being the foundation nobody has to acknowledge. She stood up slowly, holding herself the careful way people do when they're trying not to fall apart in front of someone they've hurt. At the door, she turned back. I'm sorry, Derek. I know it's not enough, but I am. I believe you, I said. And I did. Word travels fast in an industry as small as ours, and by the following Monday, it had apparently traveled all the way through Whitfield and Cross. Priya told me carefully, the way she tells me anything she thinks might upset me, that one of the associates at Nadia's firm had reached out to a mutual contact of ours, asking, off the record, whether it was true that the Callaway acquisition thing had actually been personal. I didn't respond to any of it directly. I've never seen the value in managing a narrative I didn't start and don't need to win. But I heard, secondhand, the way these things always travel, that Nadia's new partnership had gotten considerably quieter in the weeks after that dinner. Fewer of the informal lunches, fewer of the casual hallway conversations that had apparently been so easy for her to enjoy without me in the room. Preston Vale's name, I was told, came up less and less at the firm as the weeks went on, the way names do, once the thing that made them interesting stops being interesting. I didn't take any particular satisfaction in that. I want to be honest about that. It just confirmed something I already suspected, that a lot of what had felt, from the inside of that dining room, like an entire world closing ranks around Nadia and against me, was actually a much smaller and much more fragile thing than it looked like from the doorway. She left. I sat in that hotel suite for a long time after the door closed, watching the harbor, and I thought about the fact that the version of this story that gets told at dinner parties for the next 10 years will probably be the one where I'm the villain. The wealthy husband who torched a young man's company out of jealousy, who used $41 million as a blunt instrument because his ego got bruised at a partnership dinner. I understand how that version sounds from the outside, but here is what actually happened. I didn't sell that stake to hurt Preston Vale. I sold it because the relationship that made that investment sustainable, trust, mentorship, a table I thought we all sat at, honestly, was already gone by the time I found out about it. Continuing to be his majority backer, continuing to sit across from him in board meetings talking about growth projections while he sat across from my wife in ways I hadn't been invited to know about, was something I was not willing to do for any valuation on earth. I have been called cold in the weeks since, calculated, unfeeling, A mutual friend told Sean, who told me, that someone at that dinner described what I did to Preston's company as the most expensive tantrum in Boston history, which I'll admit, stung more than most of the criticism, mostly because it was clever, and mostly because it was wrong in a way that would have taken more than a clever line to actually explain. I've thought a lot about why that particular criticism bothered me more than the others. I think it's because it assumes the two things, the emotion and the decision, were the same action. That selling the steak was the tantrum itself, when in reality, the tantrum was the thing I didn't do. I didn't flip the table at Aurelia. I didn't call Preston Vale a dozen names in front of 13 witnesses. I didn't post anything, say anything, or make a single scene that would have given anyone in that room a story more interesting than the one where a man quietly walked out and let his lawyer handle the rest the next morning. The sale was not the emotional reaction. The sale was what happened after I'd already had the emotional reaction, privately, on a sidewalk on Berkeley Street, where nobody but me ever had to see it. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters. The night I stood in that doorway at Aurelia and watched a stranger's hand rest on the back of my wife's chair, I felt every single thing there was to feel. All of it, all at once. The kind of loss that doesn't have a clean shape to it. It's in the coffee mug that's been in the same cabinet for 6 years. It's in the trial notes she left in the second drawer of the desk in the study. It's in every dinner we ever hosted for people I thought were becoming part of our life, instead of an exit from it. I felt all of it. I simply didn't perform it in front of 13 strangers in a private dining room, because performing it wouldn't have changed a single fact about what had already happened. There's a distinction I don't think people make often enough between not feeling something and refusing to let a feeling make your decisions for you. I have sat in rooms where a bad quarter made grown men raise their voices at people who had nothing to do with causing it. And I have watched what that kind of unmanaged reaction actually costs. Not just in the immediate mess of it, but in the years afterward, in the way people remember you as someone whose worst moment was allowed to run the room. My father taught me that. Chess taught me that. 11 years of closing difficult deals taught me that. You close the position cleanly. You know exactly what's yours. You walk away from what no longer works, and you let the silence carry the rest of the weight so you don't have to carry it in public. The divorce itself took 11 weeks from filing to finalization, which, Anita told me, was close to a record for a case with our level of joint assets. Massachusetts doesn't require either party to prove fault, and I never once tried to use what happened at Aurelia as leverage in the settlement, mostly because I didn't need to. Nadia's attorney opened with a request for spousal support and a claim on a percentage of the firm, arguing her presence in my life during its early years had contributed to its growth. Anita's response was 3 pages long and included 6 years of tax filings showing the firm was profitable before Nadia and I had our first date. The claim was withdrawn within a week. We split the remaining joint assets close to evenly, which felt right to me. 9 years is 9 years, regardless of how the last 8 months of it went. And I wasn't interested in using the courts to make a point I'd already made myself the night I sold the Lucent stake. She kept the Beacon Street apartment. I told Anita not to fight her on it. I was already living somewhere I liked better, somewhere that didn't have 9 years of furniture arranged around a version of my life that no longer existed. I went back to Beacon Street exactly once. On a Saturday afternoon, Nadia had agreed to be out of the apartment to collect the last of what belonged to me. The chess set my father had given me for my 30th birthday, a box of law school textbooks she'd insisted I keep because I used to quiz her out of them on Sunday mornings, a framed photo from our wedding that I almost left behind, and then, at the last second, wrapped in a towel and packed anyway. Because pretending 9 years hadn't happened felt like its own kind of dishonesty. The apartment looked different already. She'd rearranged the living room, moved the couch to where the bookshelf used to be, and I remember standing in the doorway of what used to be my study, now apparently already repurposed into something else, feeling less like a man losing something, and more like a man confirming that the thing he'd lost had already, quietly, been gone for a while, before he ever noticed the room had changed. Preston Vale, for what it's worth, took the Cascade deal. I heard through the same industry channels that eventually tell you everything that he stayed on for 4 months as a consultant during the transition, and then left to start something new, smaller, self-funded this time, which I choose to believe was less a punishment and more an education, the kind everyone eventually needs and almost nobody asks for. Somebody who used to work with him told a mutual contact that the new venture was struggling to find its first round of outside capital, that investors kept asking pointed questions about what had actually happened at Lucent, and that Preston had started telling people the split had been amicable, which is one word for it, I suppose, if you define amicable as a man finding out his majority backer had personal reasons to stop backing him and choosing not to fight it in public. I don't know if that's true. I stopped tracking his career closely enough to know for certain, mostly because once the deal closed and the paperwork was signed, I genuinely stopped thinking about him at all, which surprised me more than almost anything else that happened that entire year. 7 weeks later, I was standing in a new apartment on the Seaport waterfront, a building I'd held a stake in since before I ever met Nadia, a place I'd always liked from the outside and never had a reason to actually live in until now. My phone rang early on a Tuesday morning, a number I didn't recognize, area code out of New York. "Is this Derek Calloway?" A man's voice, unhurried, careful in the way people are careful when they've rehearsed an opening line. "It is. My name is Marcus Feld. I'm managing partner at a growth equity fund out of New York. We've been tracking the Cascade acquisition of Lucent filings with a fair amount of interest. The underlying technology is strong, and frankly, the situation with the founder's exit made the deal move faster than it should have, which tells me you know how to read a room better than most people in this industry. I understand you were the primary architect behind that company's early growth." "I was involved," I said. "I'm raising a new fund," Marcus continued. "Legal technology, compliance infrastructure, it's about to get crowded with the wrong kind of capital, and I'd rather build it with the right kind. I'd like to have a conversation, if you have the time." I looked out at the harbor, flat and silver in the early light, big enough to make the last 2 months feel, for just a second, appropriately small. "I have time next week," I said. We met the following Thursday at a hotel bar near the public garden, because Marcus was in town for another meeting and didn't want to wait for me to fly to New York. He was younger than his voice had suggested, maybe 38, with the specific restlessness of someone who's spent a career watching other people's funds succeed and has finally decided to stop watching. He didn't waste time on small talk, which I appreciated. "I'll be direct," he said, sliding a folder across the table that I didn't open yet. "I don't care about the personal situation with Lucent. I care that you took a company from a $3 million valuation to over $40 million in under 2 years without diluting the founding team's motivation to keep building. And I care that you had the discipline to exit clean the moment the situation stopped serving you, instead of riding it into the ground out of ego. That's rarer than people think. Most operators in your position either hold on too long because they're attached, or panic sell too early because they're scared. You did neither. You make it sound more strategic than it was," I said. "Everything looks more strategic in hindsight than it felt in the moment," he said. "That's true of every good decision I've ever made too. Doesn't make it less real." We talked for 2 hours. By the end of it, I understood he wasn't just offering me a seat at his table. He wanted me to help build the table itself, structuring the fund's thesis around exactly the kind of infrastructure investing I'd spent a decade quietly getting right. It was the first conversation in 6 weeks that had nothing to do with Nadia, nothing to do with Aurelia, nothing to do with anything except the actual work. And I remember walking out of that hotel bar into the cold feeling something close to lightness for the first time since that dinner. 6 weeks after that, Calloway Feld Ventures closed its first fund, $62 million in initial commitments. 4 portfolio companies signed in the first quarter alone. The work was the same work I'd always done. The instincts were the same instincts. I was, in every way that mattered, still exactly who I'd always been. Except I slept through the night now, in a way I hadn't in longer than I'd let myself admit, because there is something clarifying about surviving the exact thing you were most afraid of. You find out the floor doesn't actually disappear. You find out the life on the other side of it is still a life, still yours, still worth building, still standing on a foundation nobody can quietly hand away to somebody else while you're not looking. I ran into Nadia once, about 4 months after the divorce was finalized. Back Bay, a Saturday morning, she was coming out of a coffee shop on Newbury Street, and I was walking toward the same block for a meeting. We both stopped for a half second, the particular pause of 2 people who weren't expecting to see each other in a context that used to be ordinary. "Derek," she said. "Nadia." A pause, not an uncomfortable one, just a pause. "How are you?" she asked. "Good," I said. "Really good." "You're doing well," she said. "I heard about the new fund. Good momentum so far," I said. "How's the partnership?" Good, she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like an apology dressed up as small talk. I made first chair on a case last month. Big one. I thought about calling you, actually. You were the person who always wanted to hear about that stuff. I'm glad it's going well, I said, and I meant it. She shifted her coffee cup to her other hand, the way people do when they're deciding whether to say the thing they actually came to say. Preston and I aren't together anymore, she said. In case you were wondering, we didn't last long after everything. I wasn't wondering, I said. And it was true, though I understood why she might have needed to tell me anyway. But I'm sorry it didn't work out, if that's something you wanted. I don't think I wanted him actually, she said, more to herself than to me. I think I wanted to feel like the version of myself I was becoming deserved someone who'd never had to build anything. That probably doesn't make sense. It makes more sense than you'd think, I said. You spent 9 years married to a man who talked about spreadsheets at dinner parties. I imagine a man who'd never had to build a spreadsheet in his life felt like a vacation, for a while. She almost laughed at that. The first real almost laugh I'd heard from her since the divorce. That's a little too accurate, she said. She studied me for a second. You always meant it, didn't you, she said quietly, when you said you believed in me. I know that now. I didn't have an answer for that one. Some things don't have an answer that fits into a doorway on a Saturday morning on Newbury Street. Take care of yourself, I said. You too, she said. And we went our separate ways. Both of us, I think, a little lighter than we'd been walking toward each other 5 minutes earlier. People ask me sometimes, usually people who've heard some version of this story secondhand, whether I regret how fast I moved that first night. Whether a cooler head, given a week instead of 11 hours, would have made a different set of decisions. I've thought about that question honestly, more than once, usually somewhere around 2 in the morning when the rest of the city has gone quiet enough that you can't avoid your own thoughts anymore. And the answer I keep landing on is no. Not because speed is always right. Speed is not always right. But because I understood, standing in that doorway watching a stranger's hand rest on the back of my wife's chair, that the version of me who waited a week to decide how he felt about it was the version of me who was going to spend that week hoping there was an explanation generous enough to make the picture make sense. There wasn't. There never was going to be. And every day I spent hoping otherwise would have been a day I handed to 2 people who had already spent 8 months taking things from me without asking. I think about the nameplate a lot. Honestly, more than I think about almost anything else from that night. Cream cardstock, gold script, my name spelled correctly. Somebody had to order that nameplate. Somebody had to hand it to the coordinator and say, yes, put this one at the head of the table. This one's reserved. And then, at some point in the 2 weeks between ordering it and the night it sat on that table, somebody made a second decision. Not to cancel the reservation, not to admit the seat didn't need reserving anymore, but to simply let another man sit in it and hope I wouldn't notice, or hope I would notice and be too composed to make it a scene. I have turned that specific detail over in my mind more times than I can count, because it tells you something the affair itself doesn't. An affair is a decision made in private, over months, in rooms nobody else can see into, but a nameplate with my name on it, sitting empty in front of a room full of witnesses, while another man's hand rested on my wife's chair. That wasn't private. That was a choice made in the open, dressed up as an accident. And some part of me will always respect the honesty of that, even as it was the thing that finished the marriage entirely. My name is Derek Calloway. I'm 43 years old. I run an investment fund out of Boston, Massachusetts, and I built every part of it with my own judgment and an absolute refusal to let the worst night of my life write the rest of the story. 2 months ago, I walked into a private dining room, expecting to sit down and celebrate my wife's biggest professional milestone. And instead I found out that my seat had already been given away, quietly, deliberately, weeks in advance, to a man I had personally made wealthy. And my life split cleanly into 2 halves that night, before I saw that chair, and after. I didn't make a scene. I didn't scream in a doorway or beg anyone to explain themselves in front of a room full of strangers. I closed the position, the way I've closed every difficult position in 11 years of business, cleanly, deliberately, without letting anyone watch the moment it actually cost me something. And then I got back to work. Not because I didn't feel it, I felt every part of it, but because I have learned, the hard way, that the most powerful thing you can do in the moment you most want to react is to simply decide instead. And here's the thing nobody tells you about being erased from your own seat at your own wife's table. It forces you to look at everything that's actually still yours. What's left standing once someone takes their version of you along with them when they go. I found it in strange places, in the weeks after, in the fact that my hands still knew how to build a term sheet at 2 in the morning without shaking, in the fact that my father still called every Sunday at the same time, that Sean still showed up with 2 coffees instead of 1, that my mother still asked pointed questions I didn't always want to answer, in the fact that Priya still had coffee waiting on my desk every morning like the world hadn't tilted at all, because to her, professionally, it hadn't. The firm was fine, the numbers were fine, and everything that had actually broken had broken somewhere. The balance sheet couldn't see it. I found it too, in the apartment on the water, in the specific quiet of a space that had never belonged to anyone but me, where nothing in any drawer had a history attached to a person who was no longer in the room. There is a particular kind of peace in unpacking boxes into a life nobody else has already furnished for you, in choosing where the coffee mugs go without checking whether the placement matches 9 years of somebody else's habits. I didn't expect that peace to arrive as early as it did. I expected grief to take longer to make room for anything else. It didn't, not because the grief wasn't real, but because underneath it, apparently, there had been a whole life waiting patiently for me to notice it was still mine. What I found, standing in that hotel suite, and later in that apartment on the water, and later still in a conference room in New York, building something entirely new. What I found is that what was left was substantial. It always had been. She just never managed to take it with her, because it was never hers to take in the first place. Derek never raised his voice, never made a scene, never let anyone in that room see exactly how much it cost him to watch another man sitting in his seat. He just handled it with more composure than most people could manage on their best day. And I think that's the part everyone misses about moments like this. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do after being betrayed in public is absolutely nothing, at least not right away. Because timing, more than anger, is the thing that actually wins. He didn't need to make her feel small in that dining room to prove what he was worth. He already knew. That's the difference between reacting to a betrayal and answering one. If this story hit you, let me know in the comments. Would you have walked out of that dinner the way Derek did, or would you have said something right there at the table? Tell me honestly, because I've heard both answers from people close to me, and I'm not sure either one is wrong. And if you want more stories like this one, when they come out, hit subscribe now, because we're just getting started here, and there's a lot more where this came from.